Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we're exploring a truly influential and, I think, essential book. It's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Beverly Daniel Tatum, Ph.D.
We thank you so much for listening, and we do hope you'll consider subscribing for our future content. And we want to be really clear up front. The voices you're hearing are generated by AI, but the content, all the ideas and the research, that comes straight from Dr. Tatum's book.
Right.
We feel this is just a great way to learn about African American history and the very current complexities of race relations that she outlines so well.
Absolutely. The book gives you this crucial psychological lens to view a problem that is, well, it's just so persistent in our society.
Yeah.
It connects the structural realities to how we form our own identities. And after you hear our conversation today, we really do encourage you to go out and purchase this book, support the author and her incredible work.
So our mission today is to really unpack the core psychological theories that Dr. Tatum uses. She explains why race is still such a defining factor in American life, and she connects those personal identity struggles, like the kids in the cafeteria, to these really big, persistent structural barriers across society.
And we're drawing heavily from the updated 2017 edition, right?
That's right. It includes a lot of context on some of the more recent setbacks to racial progress, which is, incredibly relevant.
Okay, let's get right into it then. Dr. Tatum starts by looking way back to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1906. He said the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. And what's so powerful is that more than a century later, that line is still incredibly stubborn.
It is, even with the demographics of the country changing so fast. I mean, you have authors like Steve Phillips writing in Brown is the New White about this rapid shift.
Yeah.
This new majority of people of color is gaining all this electoral and economic power. But the structural barriers Dr. Tatum talks about, they're still firmly in place. And that friction, well, it creates a lot of anxiety and conflict.
And that brings us directly to what she calls the structural linchpin of it all.
Residential segregation.
Exactly. And when we talk about that, we have to start with this term she uses, hyper-segregated neighborhoods. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean?
Sure. So hypersegregation isn't just, a neighborhood that's mostly one race. It's a term researchers use for an extreme level of segregation. It means the community is racially and often economically isolated across multiple different measures at once.
So it's a deep, compounded isolation.
Precisely. And the key takeaway from the book is that this didn't happen by accident. It's not just about people choosing to live with people like them. It's rooted in very deliberate, historical, race-based policies.
And this is where that distinction between race and class becomes so important. It wasn't just about money.
Not at all. That's a crucial distinction. The book details all these systematic ways that non-white Americans were just blocked from building wealth through real estate.
Like what specifically?
Well, you had racially restrictive real estate covenants, which were literally clauses written into property deeds saying you couldn't sell to black people or Jewish people or Asian people.
Wow.
Then there was racial steering. That's when real estate agents would, subtly guide black families away from white neighborhoods, even if they could easily afford them.
And of course, redlining.
Yes, redlining is maybe the most infamous. Lenders literally drawing red lines on a map around entire neighborhoods, mostly black neighborhoods, and just refusing to issue mortgages there. It cut off the flow of capital completely.
It's just so blatant when you look back at it.
It is. And on top of the official policies, you had the unofficial enforcement. White homeowners associations using threats, boycotts, and sometimes outright violence to keep their communities segregated. This was active, not passive.
And what's really shocking, what the book makes so clear, is how much the government was behind this, especially the Federal Housing Administration.
It really speaks to how deep that color line runs. The FHA, which was created to help Americans buy homes, actually endorsed those racially restrictive covenants.
All the way up until when?
Until 1950. And think about this. That was 2 years after the Supreme Court, in Shelley v. Kramer, had already declared those covenants legally unenforceable.
So the FHA just kept doing it anyway.
For 2 whole years, they kept encouraging the development of racially exclusive suburbs, and that baked the economic disparity right into the map of America.
And that's the mechanism that makes it all so persistent today, right? The intergenerational transmission of wealth.
That's it, exactly. For most American families, home equity is their single biggest asset. It's how you build wealth to pass on to your kids.
But if you're systematically blocked from buying a home, or you're forced into a neighborhood where property values are designed to fall,
then that whole engine for building wealth is just It's broken for you. The wealth gap we see today wasn't an accident. It was engineered.
And you can still see the effects of that engineering in cities today. What does the book say about, modern attitudes?
Well, the data shows that progress is really limited. In big cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, there's a clear pattern. White residents in surveys say they get more and more uncomfortable as the hypothetical percentage of black neighbors goes up.
And that collective discomfort becomes a real barrier to integration.
A huge barrier. It translates into the hard numbers of hypersegregation. As of the 2010 census, about a third of all black people in metropolitan areas lived in these hypersegregated neighborhoods.
And does this apply to other groups as well?
It does. We see a similar, though slightly different, pattern for Latinx families, nearly 20% in cities like New York and LA. But it's more nuanced.
How so?
It often depends on country of origin and, really significantly, on skin color. Darker-skinned Latinx people, say from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, often live in or near African-American neighborhoods.
Whereas lighter-skinned Latinx individuals might have a different experience.
Right. They may self-identify as white and are more likely to live in integrated areas with non-Hispanic whites. So color is still a huge factor even within ethnic groups.
So even if you're a person of color and you manage to become affluent, you still can't escape this. There's a cost of segregation.
You absolutely cannot. The research is so clear on this. An affluent black family is still likely to live in a neighborhood with worse schools, less access to quality food, and more environmental hazards than a white family with the exact same income.
And what about social networks? That seems huge.
It's critical. Think
Yeah.
about how you hear about a job opening or which school has a great program. A lot of that comes from your neighbors. When you segregate neighborhoods, you fracture those vital social networks. You're cutting people off from opportunities, which links economic disadvantage and racial disadvantage together, and it just reinforces the whole cycle. That's why segregation is the linchpin.
So building on that structural foundation, the book then looks at the 2 decades from 1997 to 2017. And while there was some real social change, she highlights 3 really stubborn setbacks that undermined a lot of that progress.
Right.
The first one was the anti-affirmative action backlash.
Yes. This mostly played out in higher education. It made it incredibly difficult for big state universities, like in California or Michigan, to build a diverse student body because they couldn't consider race as a factor anymore.
And this went all the way to the Supreme Court with the Fisher v. University of Texas case in 2016.
It did. And while the court ultimately did uphold the university's right to use race as one small factor in a big holistic review, the fact that there was so much litigation, so much political pressure,
It had a chilling effect.
a huge chilling effect. It forced universities to jump through all these complicated hoops to try and achieve diversity, and it signaled a real resistance to any proactive efforts.
Okay, the second major setback she identifies is the Great Recession in 2008.
A total disaster, and one that hit families of color so much harder than white families.
Right. It wasn't an equal opportunity crisis.
Not at all. Massive losses of homes and jobs in Black and Latinx communities. And crucially, the recovery didn't close that gap. The book points out that in late 2016, the Black unemployment rate was still almost double the white rate.
And the wealth gap actually got worse.
It did. It hit its highest point in 25 years. It just confirms this devastating pattern that when America gets a cold, communities of color get pneumonia, they suffer the most and recover the slowest.
And that leads to the third, and maybe the most devastating setback of all, mass incarceration.
This is a system that Dr. Tatum frames as really the latest chapter in a long history of social control.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look at history, every time there was a period of Black progress, like after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, it was met with a violent backlash.
Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, lynching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All designed to reassert white control. The book argues that mass incarceration, which really took off with the war on drugs, should be seen in that same light. It's a reaction to the gains of the civil rights movement.
And this is where she brings in Michelle Alexander's work on the new Jim Crow, right?
Yes, that argument is central. Alexander's point is that today there are more African-American adults under correctional control, that's prison, jail, probation, or parole, than were enslaved in 1850.
That's a staggering comparison.
It is, because what the system does is create this permanent second-class status. Once you have a felony record, you can be legally discriminated against in jobs, housing, voting, all the things the original Jim Crow laws did.
And the engine for this was largely nonviolent drug offenses.
That's the key. At the federal level, half the prison population is there for drug convictions, and most of them have no history of violence.
And we know drug use is not confined to communities of color.
Not even close. The majority of illegal drug users and dealers in the U.S. are white. But the enforcement, the policing, disproportionately targets Black and Latinx communities. The sentencing got harsher, too. The average sentence for a drug offender tripled between the mid-'80s and the mid-2000s.
The disparities for women are also pretty stark.
Unbelievably so. The rate of imprisonment for women grew way faster than for men. And in 2014, Black women were being incarcerated at more than twice the rate of white women. The whole system just rips apart the social fabric of communities.
There's one statistic in the book about the impact on families that is just, it's heartbreaking.
It really is. Dr. Tatum quotes Michelle Alexander, who points out that a Black child born today is less likely to be raised by both parents than a Black child who was born during slavery.
Wow.
And that's largely because of the disappearance of Black fathers into the criminal justice system. It shows just how deeply these structural issues, segregation, the justice system, are tearing at the most basic unit of a community.
That structural context really sets the stage for the book's main focus, which is the psychology of it all.
Mm-hmm.
In the next part, Dr. Tatum really puts on her hat as a clinical psychologist. She's been teaching the psychology of racism since 1980, and she makes this great point that a good theory isn't just academic.
No, it's intensely practical.
Exactly. It gives you the language and the framework to make sense of what you see around you every single day.
And this is where getting the definitions right is so important. She starts by making a clear distinction between prejudice and racism.
Okay, so how does she define prejudice?
Prejudice is pretty straightforward. It's a preconceived judgment or opinion that's usually based on limited or incomplete information. And she basically says, look, we all have prejudices. In a complex society where we're bombarded with stereotypes and misinformation, it's almost impossible not to.
So prejudice is an individual attitude that anyone can have. But her definition of racism is very different, and that's what really shifts the conversation.
It's a huge shift. Because she takes the focus off of individual meanness or bad intentions and puts it squarely on the system.
So what is her definition?
Her definition is that racism is a system of advantage based on race. It's supported and kept in place by institutions, by cultural norms, and by individual actions and policies.
So what that means is, if you're a white person in the United States, you benefit from this system.
Yes. Regardless of your personal feelings, whether you're a good person or not is irrelevant to the definition. The system is operating and conferring advantages to you, whether you asked for them or not.
And that systemic idea leads right into her famous analogy for cultural racism.
The smog analogy. It's so effective.
It really is. Can you lay that out for us?
Sure. So cultural racism is all the pervasive messages in our society that reinforce the idea of white superiority and the inferiority of people of color. And she says it's like smog in the air. You know, you don't go around calling yourself a smog breather. But if you live in a smoggy city, you are breathing the air. You can't help it. And in a race-conscious society full of media stereotypes and historical blind spots, we're all breathing in that cultural smog. We all internalize its messages.
And if we're all breathing it in, what's the psychological impact? How does it manifest?
For people who are the targets of that smog, the result is something called internalized oppression.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the psychological outcome of that constant exposure. It's when members of a stereotyped group start to internalize those negative, distorted messages about their own group.
So they might start to believe the stereotypes themselves.
Exactly. They might question their own intelligence or their beauty or their competence because they've been bombarded with negative messages their entire lives.
Okay, so that brings us to the core concept of identity. The book focuses on racial identity, the meaning we attach to belonging to a certain racial group.
Right. Though she broadens it a little to REC, identity, racial, ethnic, cultural, to be more inclusive.
But the main point is that identity is not a simple thing. It's a multidimensional self.
It's incredibly complex. Your racial identity is shaped by your gender, your class, your sexual orientation, your religion. All these other factors intersect.
But there's a huge difference in how this plays out depending on whether you're in the dominant group or not.
A massive difference. For the dominant group, in this case, white people, their racial identity often goes completely unexamined. It's just the default setting, the societal norm.
It's invisible because it's the standard that everyone else is measured against.
Precisely. But for subordinate groups, it's the opposite. They're constantly being reminded of their race, and they are often labeled as, different or defective in some way.
And that forces them to pay very close attention to the dominant group.
Yes, this is based on a principle from social psychologist Susan Fiske, which is that people pay attention to those who control their outcomes.
That makes perfect sense.
If the dominant group has power over your job, your housing, your safety, you have to become an expert on them. You have to monitor them to try and predict what's going to happen to you. It's an extra psychological weight that dominant group members just don't have to carry.
And all of that brings us back to the question in the title. That grouping in the cafeteria is an expression of this whole process of racial identity development in adolescence.
It's a completely natural part of that process. It usually kicks into high gear in adolescence.
What triggers it?
Often it's a specific event or a series of them, a racial slur, a microaggression, some incident that forces a young person to realize, oh, racism is not just a history lesson, it affects me personally.
And the research shows this starts pretty early.
It does, usually middle school and junior high, and often a bit earlier for Black students, especially Black girls, who have to deal with societal pressures around their appearance at a younger age.
So when they sit together, it's not about being anti-white or exclusionary.
Not at all. It's about seeking affirmation. It's a search for support and a safe space to figure out what it means to be Black in an environment, like a mostly white school, that can feel confusing or even hostile. It's a place where you don't have to constantly explain yourself.
This need for affirmation also plays out in the classroom, and it can lead to this really difficult dynamic known as the acting white stigma. Can you unpack the psychology behind that?
This is such a misunderstood phenomenon. It's basically peer pressure, where some Black students start to see high academic achievement and the behaviors associated with it, like speaking properly or taking AP classes, as being part of white culture.
So they reject it.
They do. But Dr. Tatum argues this isn't about being lazy or not valuing education. It's a deep-seated coping strategy.
A coping strategy for what?
For disappointment and resentment. If you're in a school where Black students are consistently underperforming compared to white students, one way to regain a sense of dignity and power is to reject the whole system. They choose racial solidarity with their peers over an individual success that might isolate them.
So it's a defense mechanism against a system they feel has already failed them.
Precisely. If the game feels rigged, why play by the rules? It's less painful to reject the game and find your value somewhere else, with your peers who get it.
The book also points to the lack of role models in the K-12 curriculum as a big part of this problem.
A huge part. Black students talk about this all the time. They get the same three people, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, over and over again.
Right. From kindergarten to senior year.
It creates such a shallow understanding of their own history. Then they get to college and take an African American studies class, and it's this huge aha moment. They discover this vast history of Black scientists, writers, artists, inventors. It's incredibly affirming.
And that affirmation is what helps build a strong, positive identity that can push back against that acting white critique.
Exactly. It gives them a broader, richer definition of what it means to be Black and successful.
Okay, let's move into the next part, where the book explores the very distinct ways identity is formed for different racial and ethnic groups. Starting with some of the nuances within the Black experience itself. The first one she discusses is color and hair, this legacy of colorism inside the Black community.
This is a perfect example of that internalized oppression we talked about. It's how the smog of cultural racism gets inside a community and creates its own hierarchies.
The idea of good hair.
Right. Dr. Tatum talks about growing up hearing that phrase, and good hair always meant straight hair. It was a direct reflection of Eurocentric beauty standards. And even if it's not talked about openly, the messages get sent when, lighter-skinned children or those with straighter hair are praised or favored. It just adds another layer of complexity to building a positive self-image.
Okay, next, a really critical concept. Stereotype threat. We know it's the risk of confirming a negative stereotype, but can you explain the actual mechanism? How does it work in the brain?
It's all about working memory. Your working memory is what you use for problem solving and complex thought. It has a limited capacity.
Okay.
So for a Black student taking a high-stakes test, they're not just focused on the math problems. A part of their working memory is being consumed by anxiety, the fear of confirming that negative stereotype about Black intellectual inferiority.
So their brain is doing two jobs at once.
Exactly. It's trying to solve the problem. And it's trying to suppress all these intrusive, stressful thoughts. That's a huge cognitive load. It makes you inefficient. You might reread a question 5 times because your focus is split.
And the research on this is just incredible. They could trigger it with something as simple as a checkbox.
It's amazing. Claude Steele's research showed that just having students check a box for their race at the beginning of a standardized test was enough to activate the threat and significantly lower their scores.
But if they move the box to the end of the test?
Their scores often went up to match their white peers.
Right.
Because the threat wasn't activated, their working memory was free to just focus on the test.
So what's the solution to this? How do you combat it?
The book points to promoting an incremental view of intelligence.
Meaning,
The belief that intelligence isn't a fixed thing you're born with, it's something you can grow through effort and hard work. The mindset is work hard, get smart.
it shifts the focus from proving you're smart to just improving yourself.
Exactly. And that shift can neutralize the anxiety of the threat.
Now let's shift to the Latinx experience. Here, the identity struggle often centers around language and legal status.
Right. Language is so central to cultural identity. It's how you express the emotions of mi familia, family life.
But schools in the U.S. have historically tried to erase that.
Oh, absolutely. The book has examples of parents being told by teachers or nuns to stop speaking Spanish at home with the idea that it would help their kids learn English faster.
Which has this devastating effect of creating an emotional distance within the family.
A huge distance. The child loses the language of intimacy with their own parents, and this devaluing of Spanish often led young people to feel shame about it.
They would try to hide it.
Yes, avoid speaking Spanish in public to try and pretend to be that American. But it puts them in this impossible limbo. One student talked about how her non-Latinx friends saw her as so Spanish, but her Latinx friends saw her as whiter than white because her Spanish wasn't perfect.
And this limbo gets taken to a whole other level of crisis for undocumented teens.
This is a really tragic situation that Dr. Tatum calls suspended illegality.
What does she mean by that?
Well, these are kids who are brought to the U.S. when they're very young. They go to U.S. schools, they have U.S. friends, they absorb U.S. culture. They are, for all intents and purposes, American kids. And often, they don't even know they're undocumented.
But there's a moment when that reality comes crashing down. A turning point.
There is. It usually happens around age 16. That's when all their friends are getting their driver's licenses, applying for after-school jobs, filling out forms for college aid.
All of which require a Social Security number.
Exactly. And the undocumented teen suddenly hits this wall. Dr. Tatum calls it a paralyzing shock. The future they thought they had just vanishes. It's an incredible emotional trauma.
And even if they do really well in school, it doesn't solve the problem. They hit an occupational dead end.
It's tragic. Even the ones who go to college often end up, by their mid-20s, working the same low-wage, under-the-table jobs as their parents who never finished high school. The realization that all their education should mean something but doesn't because of their legal status is just crushing.
Now let's turn to Asian American identity. The book starts by stressing the huge diversity in this group. It's not a monolith.
Not at all. You're talking about people with roots in China, the Philippines, India, Vietnam, Korea, dozens of different cultures. It's the fastest growing racial group with high rates of intermarriage.
And a lot of the modern story of this group is shaped by something called hyperselectivity. What is that?
Hyperselectivity refers to the fact that after 1965, U.S. immigration policy favored people with high levels of education and professional skills.
So we weren't getting a random sample of the population from these countries.
Not even close. We were getting their best and brightest. Immigrants from, say, China have much higher rates of college degrees than both the general population back in China and the native-born U.S. population.
And this hyperselectivity is what fuels the model minority paradox.
It's the foundation of it. Because you have this highly educated, highly motivated group, they tend to do very well. And this creates what's called stereotype promise.
Which is the opposite of stereotype threat.
Exactly. It's the performance boost you get from being expected to succeed. Teachers might assume an Asian student is good at math and put them in an advanced class, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But this model minority idea is really harmful, isn't it?
It's incredibly harmful. First, it hides the huge disparities within the group. Certain subgroups, like Bhutanese or Cambodian Americans, have very high dropout rates that get ignored.
And it's used as a weapon against other groups.
Yes. It's used to say, look, they made it, why can't you? It completely ignores the structural advantage of hyperselectivity and pits communities of color against each other.
It also encourages invisibility and silence about the racism that Asian Americans do face.
It does. Students in the book talk about being called racial slurs, and when they report it, administrators do nothing. The feeling is that their problems aren't taken seriously because they're seen as the successful minority, so they learn to just stay silent.
Finally, let's touch on Native American identity, which is so often defined by invisibility and misrepresentation.
The first thing to understand is the incredible diversity. There are 567 federally recognized sovereign nations in the U.S., but this diversity is built on a shared experience of profound historical trauma.
The boarding school system, in particular.
The trauma from that is immense, and it echoes through generations. Kids were taken from their families, forbidden from speaking their language. There are stories of having their mouths washed out with soap for it. They grew up without any model of healthy parenting, which created cycles of trauma that are still being dealt with today.
And in today's classrooms, they're often just invisible.
Completely. Because of mixed heritage, they don't always look Native American to a teacher, and the curriculum almost never includes their history. The book tells the story of a third-grade Paiute girl watching a film that showed pioneers fighting savage Indians, her ancestors.
Oh.
And her teacher was completely unprepared to have a real conversation about the context, about the settlers bringing diseases and taking land. So the little girl just had to sit there and listen to her classmates condemn her own people.
And this kind of misrepresentation feeds right into the harm caused by sports mascots.
It does. The research shows that these mascots, whether they're seen as positive stereotypes like being brave or negative ones, they all do harm. They lower the self-esteem of Native youth and they limit what they can imagine for their own futures. It constantly reminds them of this cartoonish, one-dimensional way that other people see them.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground on the structural barriers and the psychological impact on people of color. Let's turn now to the challenge of white identity. Dr. Tatum uses a model from psychologist Janet Helms, which basically says that being part of the dominant racial group has its own psychological journey.
Right. It's a cycle of identity development.
Yeah.
And it starts with stage 1, contact.
What does the world look like from the contact stage?
In this stage, whiteness is just the unexamined norm. People see themselves as colorblind. They think racism is just about individual acts of meanness, a person using a racial slur.
So they're completely unaware of the systemic part.
Completely. They are breathing the smog, but they can't see it because it's just the air. They're unaware of what Peggy McIntosh called the invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance.
But then something happens to challenge that view, which leads to stage 2, disintegration. This is when the privilege becomes visible.
Right. This is usually triggered by a really undeniable racial event. The book uses the example of a white blogger named Jill Robbins watching the video of Philando Castile being shot by police.
And it forces this sudden, shocking realization.
Yes, she wrote about how when she gets pulled over, she has zero fear. She's just a nice white lady in a minivan. And in that moment, she understood what white privilege really means.
It's not about being rich.
No, it's about that lack of fear. It's the built-in assumption of safety and fairness when you interact with authority. And seeing something like that video makes the systemic problem impossible to ignore, which leads to a lot of guilt, anger, and discomfort.
And that dissonance can be really hard to handle. People often face resistance when they try to move out of that comfort zone.
Oh, absolutely. Family and friends might say, oh, you're just going through a phase or you're being too sensitive. They try to pull you back into the contact stage because your new awareness makes them uncomfortable.
This discomfort is especially clear when we talk about the more subtle forms of modern bias, like aversive racism.
Aversive racism describes people who genuinely believe they are egalitarian. They see themselves as good, non-prejudiced people.
The uncomfortable egalitarian.
Right. But they still hold unconscious biases or implicit preferences. And these biases come out in subtle ways, especially in ambiguous situations.
The hiring study by DeVideo and Gartner is the classic example of this, isn't it?
A perfect example. They had white students review resumes for a job. When the candidates, some white, some black, were either really strong or really weak, there was no bias. The choice was obvious.
But the bias appeared in the middle.
Exactly. When the candidates were just moderately qualified, making the decision a bit of a judgment call, that's when the implicit bias kicked in. In that scenario, the white candidates were recommended for the job 75% of the time, compared to only 50% for the identically qualified black candidates.
And that kind of subtle bias is protected by this overarching ideology of colorblindness.
Yes, the sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls this the dominant racial ideology of our time. It has two parts.
What are they?
first is color evasion. That's the I don't see color, we're all just human idea, which sounds nice, but it completely ignores the different realities people face because of their color.
As the second part.
Is power evasion. That's minimizing the impact of racism, claiming everyone has an equal opportunity, and basically blaming people of color for any disadvantages they face.
And this ideology is so harmful because it shuts down any attempt to fix the problem.
Totally. If you try to propose a race-conscious solution to a problem, you're immediately accused of playing the race card or being the real racist. It allows white people to remain comfortably ignorant and ensures the system never changes.
So if the bias is often unconscious and protected by this ideology, how do you even begin to move toward constructive action?
Well, the hiring study actually points to this solution. The bias disappeared when the qualifications were clear and unambiguous.
So clarity is the key.
Clarity is the key. And this is why Dr. Tatum advocates for goal-oriented affirmative action. The first step is to make sure your candidate pool is actually diverse. Cast a wide net. Then, from that pool of qualified candidates, you can give preference to those who help you meet your stated, transparent diversity goals.
This is not about hiring unqualified people.
Not at all. It's about being intentional when you have multiple qualified candidates. It's using that opportunity to build the kind of diverse institution you want to be. It replaces ambiguity with clarity.
But the most fundamental step, she says, is just learning to talk to each other. Overcoming the paralysis of fear.
The fear is real on all sides. White people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, of sounding ignorant, of being called racist.
And people of color are afraid of the exhaustion, the pain of telling their story again and again, and the fear of not being believed or understood.
Right. But as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Dialogue is the first step to facing it.
And there are models for how to do this effectively. Intergroup dialogue models.
The University of Michigan's program is a great example. They bring together small, facilitated groups of students from different backgrounds, say white students and students of color, for structured, long-term conversations.
And this actually works. There are measurable results.
There are. Participants show increased self-awareness, they're less afraid of conflict, they have better interactions across racial lines in their daily lives, and they're more likely to get involved in social change work afterwards. It's hard, but it moves people from being paralyzed to being engaged.
And this work needs to happen off campus too, in community initiatives.
Absolutely. Change has to be sustained by the community. She highlights groups like the Atlanta Friendship Initiative or the Community Coalition on Race in New Jersey, which have worked for years to build and maintain genuinely integrated and equitable communities.
So these models show that it is possible. The dialogue, when it's structured and intentional, can lead to real change.
Yes. The goal isn't just to fix other people, it's to recognize that dismantling these systems of oppression is good for everyone. It frees the dominant group from the psychological burden of ignorance and guilt, too.
So we have really dug into the structural realities of race, the psychological frameworks of identity, and the very specific challenges the different groups face. And we've also seen how crucial dialogue is for moving past that fear and into action.
We talked about how, for white people, a big part of the journey is recognizing and then letting go of the unearned privileges of that first contact stage. So a final thought for you to consider is about your own sphere of influence. That could be your workplace, your family, your neighborhood. What is one concrete, conscious action you could take this week, based on what we've talked about, that's anchored in the idea that dismantling racism is truly in everyone's best interests?
That is a challenging and really necessary question to take away. Thank you so much for joining us for this mini book podcast, African American Books Edition. We sincerely hope this exploration has been valuable for you. We strongly encourage you to subscribe for future content, to share this conversation with others, and please let us know in the comments below what other books you'd like to hear us feature in the future. Thank you for subscribing and listening. 5 seconds of silence.